Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the ICLR Friday Forum. To talk about the pricing of the risk of water damage claims. My name is Paul Kovacs. I'm with ICLR, and welcome to our first Friday Forum of the year. For those who've been participating in these events for a while, this is our 15th year of Friday Forums. We did our first one in 1999, and I was reflecting during the holidays. Our very first January Friday Forum in 1999 was canceled because there was so much snow in Toronto that the mayor called in the military to clean things up. And we weren't able to do our first forum. But just a reminder how wild and crazy things can be. And here we were again, having another big storm in Toronto this past winter. But we're on schedule and on track and moving forward. A little while ago, we changed our format to also invite people to join us by webinar. So welcome. We have a very large participation today by webinar. Still a reminder to everybody, if you come to the office, you get to talk directly to the presenters and ask your questions and participate in a dialogue with colleagues here. And so please do consider coming into the office and joining in for the direct discussion. But welcome to all those who are signing up. Later this year, in June, we're going to be trying something new. Again, always trying to move things forward. With a couple forecast workshops we're going to be doing in early and mid-June. In early June, we're going to do a session on the hurricane forecast for 2014 for Canada with the leaders from the Canadian Hurricane Centre. What's different about June this year, because it's the fifth year we've talked to the hurricane forecast as part of our program, is we're going to be broadcasting from the Hurricane Centre in Nova Scotia, rather than doing it here at the office. And so we're going to be bringing in a facilitator, and those who join by webinar are going to be able to pose their questions and actively be involved in the dialogue in June. And later on in June, we're going to also do the forecast for wildfire for 2014 for Canada. So this is something we're going to try, and we're looking for your feedback about how that process works. But for the rest of the year, and starting today, we're going to stick with our tried and true format. So we have a group here gathered in Toronto to talk directly about pricing water damage claims, and a chance to talk directly to our guests who've come in kindly to speak with you. And for those joining in our webinar, welcome. But again, we don't have the facilities here to take your questions. If you have questions, you can call us afterward, or we'll give you contact information for the speakers, and you can get in touch with them directly. Our three guests today are Jacqueline Friedland, Adam Pelshok, and Houston Cheng from KPMG. KPMG accepted a contract from the Canadian Institute of Actuaries to look into the challenge of pricing water damage, and specifically answer the question, why does it seem to be so hard to use historic information to predict current and future water damage claims? So this is research that was commissioned by the Institute. It's out for discussion right now. I'll let Jacqueline and others share exactly the status of the research. But you're getting an early view on what was found from that research, and a chance to learn what came out of the process of trying to understand the challenges from an actuarial point of view within the P&C industry about understanding how to price for damage claims, and some of the ideas about appropriate practices for the industry going forward. So with that introduction, welcome to everybody who's here to participate. Welcome to our speakers. Jackie.
Okay. So I'm just going to do a 2-minute intro and then really turn it over, and then I'll wrap it up. This is very much a repeat of a presentation we did about 6 weeks ago to the University of Western Ontario, where they have a continuing ed actuarial program. And we were asked to present our findings there. And Paul was at that presentation and thought that it would have great value. Now, our paper was commissioned by an actuarial body. It was intended to be used by actuaries, so there's certainly an actuarial focus. I know everyone in the room and on the phone are not actuaries. I think it's still relevant. Property pricing, unlike auto pricing, may be set in some companies, not even in all companies, by actuaries, but certainly underwriters and others have a big role in what that final price is, particularly in a commercial setting as well as in personal setting. So when I get to my part, which is really what are 6 proposed good practices for moving property pricing forward, it's always actuarial, but I think you can take the word actuary and apply it to lots of other professionals within an insurance company or brokers and others. I want to say this, especially if we have any press in the room or on the phone. This is a CIA paper, not a KPMG paper. We are asked to solicit the opinions of others and seek out research, so we shouldn't be quoted as KPMG states or as KPMG's position. And the paper is in the final approval process at the CIA. It's not even out yet. It's been approved by the research committee, but it's got to go through translation, French translation, since we operate in both languages, and then that has to be approved. So it's not yet. If there are any questions or things that will appear in the press, I'd ask that you call me or the CIA, even better yet, to really get approval. What else in terms of, as Houston will say in his introductory comments, I just want to highlight it, we were given a definition of water damage as set out by the IBC, and so it doesn't include flood. So I know you were talking before on who's flood mapping this and who's doing flood for Calgary or flood mitigation. Ours excludes flood, so that's an important point. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn it over. Why don't we switch places, because I think the little camera's here. And also, please jump in with questions to everyone in the room, and I'll jump in and interrupt my colleagues, as I tend to do.
So good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all today, and thank you for ICLR for inviting us to speak to you. We're excited to share the product of our research, and as you've heard, it's a research that we conduct on behalf of the Canadian Institute of Actuaries to water damage and pricing the risk of water damage. So what we were set out to do, and what are some of the questions that we answered through this research, is first, why are past water damage claims no longer predictive of future claims experience? Right, so we're going to go through a bit of what actuaries do and how we typically price claims and set premiums, and why some of these methods do no longer work for water damage. And we also, through our research, identified some good practices where actuaries can use, perhaps, to price water damage for the property products. So we're going to answer these 2 questions through the following 5 sections. I'm going to start by going through the background and giving a bit of the purpose and scope of our research, and going through the approach that we took to perform this research. I'm going to state the issues, so stating the issues of water damage claims, some of the shortcomings of the historic based pricing methods, and going through why the past is no longer predictive of the future, and why is the issue of water damage critical to insurance companies. And Adam's going to take over and go through some of the practices that we saw through our discussions with the various insurance companies and other parties within the insurance system. We also did a bit of research on some global alternatives. So we researched on some papers available around the world that discussed actuarial work and how they relate to water damage. And Jackie's going to wrap up and come back and talk to you about some of the good practices that we identified as being something that actuaries can use and work towards in terms of pricing water damage.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
You said that flood was not included. Do you mean river flooding?
Oh,
Because I presume urban flooding or
the sewer backup.
sewer backup.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. It's the Calgary flood, it's not the river overbank.
Yeah. So whatever is not technically covered under insurance policies. Correct. From the background, like I said, we're going to go through the purpose, scope, and approach. So the issue of water damage and increasing water damage risk to the insurance industry is not new. There was interest from the Canadian Institute of Actuaries to look into this a few years ago, and they issued a request for proposal back in 2011, looking for a very technical and quantitative solution to project future water claims. So for one reason or another, this RFP didn't result in a particular study, and a new RFP came out in mid to late 2012, and the focus of this RFP from the Canadian Institute of Actuaries was more qualitative. So the CIA wanted a more qualitative assessment of current practices of pricing water damage claims in Canada and around the world, and they wanted the researchers to identify some of the best practices that P&C actuaries may use to price water damage risk. In terms of scope, the scope was specifically defined by the Canadian Institute of Actuaries, and it relies on the Insurance Bureau of Canada, as Jackie mentioned, their IBC's definition of water damage. So the focus is on insurance coverage that's currently offered. So that includes the standard coverage, where water main breaks or overflowing from appliances such as washing machines and hot water tanks. That was included in part of the scope of the coverage. Other coverages that were included in our research was sometimes optional ground and water and sewer backup, and other optional above ground water, but not river flooding, as we previously mentioned. So really, we're just focusing on the increase in water damage risk from coverages currently offered, and we're not, we wouldn't dive into flood.
I mean, it's an interesting point because when we did a literature search on the internet, you are overwhelmed with the flood, the flood material. You know, we've done hundreds of papers, and sifting through those are the research done by actuaries or organizations, universities around the world to say, okay, that's out of scope. I mean, it was very important right at the beginning that we defined what water damage, what the CIA had intended by water damage. And one of my conclusions in doing this is just a first step for the CIA and for the industry. And there's a lot more to do within water damage. And then Paul had raised the issue at the University of Western Ontario. You could add forest fires, you get wildfires, you get all other kinds of perils to this kind of project, and the CIA will be busy for years.
So for this particular research, our approach was we wanted to know as much as possible, and that's what Jackie had mentioned. We did some research on the internet, on Google, just to understand it, try to understand what people are discussing about water damage. Some of the latest news that are coming out from either IBC, ICLR, or insurance companies, just to gain an understanding of what's happening in this area. Once we had a good understanding of the situation, we prepared a questionnaire. So this questionnaire was aimed towards various stakeholders, such as insurance companies, CAT modeling firms, regulators, consulting firms, even industry organizations. And Adam is going to get into a bit more detail of what in particular we asked or we talked to people about, and some of the results, what we're hearing from industry. These questionnaires were sent in advance to various companies. Where possible, we conducted personal interviews just because that's face-to-face meetings are a good way to gather information. We'll also receive feedback from others via electronic means. So they completed the questionnaire, and where we had questions, we went back to them for further clarification. So in total, we had 9 insurers, 2 CAT modeling firms, 2 provincial regulators, 3 actuarial consulting firms, and 2 industry organizations that participated in our survey.
When the report is published, which I expect to be probably in the next month, the sample questionnaires are actually included as part of, appendices to the report. So you can really look and see exactly what kind of information were we asking for.
Quick question, without revealing the insurers, I'm not sure whether you're doing that in the report.
No.
Approximate share of market and property cover by those 9 insurers, or is that not reportable either?
That's not, let me address this one. Because the CIA committee who sponsored this and organizes had some representation from big companies, they forced their companies to basically participate because they couldn't act as leaders of this research and not have their own companies participate. That said, there was 1 or 2 notable exceptions who, because they've invested a lot of time in research and effort, do believe it's proprietary. So now we weren't doing quantitative, we weren't building a model, we were collecting a lot of qualitative information, so I don't think our findings aren't justified, but they would have been better if we had had everyone. And we put all kinds of strings trying to get everyone to.
ICLR was one of the groups consulted.
So what's the issue? Taking a look at some of the recent news and articles, it's clear that water damage claim has been increasing dramatically. For example, Aviva issued a press release earlier last year saying that about 40% of the home insurance claims are now resulting from water damage. and that average cost of water damage claims more than doubled in 10 years. So going from just over $7,000 in 2002 to well over $15,000 in 2012.
I'm going to jump in again. Our report was drafted and sent, I think, a first draft before the flood. So even before the floods, water damage was appearing in the news almost daily in Thompson's or Canadian Underwriter or anything else, the Globe and Mail. But then, everything's just, exponentially increased since the summer floods and everything else.
And ice storm.
Ice storm.
And it's not just insurers. Regulators are also noticing this issue. So in Quebec, the Autorité des Marchés Financiers, AMF, conducted a survey of insurers operating in Quebec about the impact of climate change. And in this survey, the majority of the insurers concluded that water damage currently represents the principal source of claims. And some insurers even suggested in the survey to the AMF that this is probably likely from the increases in both the frequency and severity of precipitation in recent years. And as another example, the IBC, so Insurance Bureau of Canada, presented some figures that highlight that in terms of both number of claims and dollar amount paid, water as a peril accounts for almost half of all claims experienced in insurance companies alone in Quebec in 2011. So we know that water damage is significant, but what are some of the shortcomings of the historic-based pricing methods that actuaries use? So the fundamental assumption that actuaries often rely on is that the past is predictive of the future. And so actuaries rely on historic relationships between claim and exposures and assume that historic relationships in the data will hold in the future. However, when this fundamental assumption is relied on, extraordinary events are not considered, and that the problem is changes in either internal or external environment would invalidate this fundamental assumption. Other issues with the traditional pricing method is that data shifts and data quality are sometimes affect the way that actuaries analyze data. And so without any adjustment, the traditional methods will not capture any shifts in the data and have a big impact on the results of the actuarial analysis. And on the other hand, like if there's not enough good data, a detailed and accurate internal analysis can't be performed. And from our discussions with an insurance company, detailed and accurate internal data is often not available to the actuary. And there's also a lack of external data. So we look for some sources of external data that actuaries may rely on in the future, and Jackie's going to highlight that. So why is the past no longer predictive of the future? In the RFP, the CIA suggested three reasons, and they thought maybe climate change might be a reason that the past is no longer predictive of the future. They stated that aging and inadequate municipal infrastructure could be a reason. And they also thought that lifestyle changes in the population could result in more significant water damage claims. Through our research, we added a couple more reasons, and we grouped them under human behavior. So we're going to go through a bit of each these four categories and see how they affect the predictiveness of data from the past. So on climate change, what we found is that even though there's still a debate in some circles anyways, as to whether climate change is real, no one that we spoke to questions the increase in frequency and severity of extreme weather events over the past few years. Right? It's been documented that Canada experiences 20 more days of rain on average now than in the 1950s. How climate change affects insurance is a bit more unclear. I reviewed a few sources around the world. For example, from Australia, we reviewed a submission that the Institute of Actuaries of Australia submitted to the Australia Senate Standing Committee on Environment and Communications. And so the Institute, so the actuaries in Australia, concluded that the increase in claim costs due to climate change is estimated to increase about 8%, but it's spread over 60 years. Right, so what they thought is that this is a relatively small increase per year, and that the insurance industry should be able to adapt to this 8% increase over 60 years. Coming back to North America, so we had some discussions with some cat modeling firms in the U.S., And through these discussions, we were given the opinion that climate change happens over decades. Right? So they didn't think it's necessarily a major contributing factor to the increase in water damage claims. And we go back to Canada, an Environmental Canada study found that in an 80-year forecast, an 80-year forecast period, the climate change will only result in a 30% increase in water-related insured claims. So from these examples, we thought that the opinion is that climate change alone, it won't explain the increase in claims.
Again, I want carefully, it's not KPMG's opinion. We're reporting on the findings of others. I mean, we form no opinions of our own in the report.
What we did find is that climate change is adversely affecting aging and inadequate infrastructure. And so it's clear from some of the research that we've performed that the municipal infrastructure is aging and inadequate, and climate change is adversely affecting this. So on this slide, we display a few quotes that we heard from various sources. Right, so we heard often that municipal infrastructure is being operated beyond the intended design life and capacity. We also heard that infrastructure in older subdivisions may be designed to a lower standard. And others are saying that safety margins within municipal infrastructures are often insufficient. I'm not going to repeat all of these quotes. You can see some of them, and they are in the report. When the report's eventually released, you can go through them. But the bottom line is clear, and the consensus is that aging and inadequate infrastructure is contributing to increases in both frequency and severity of water damage claims. So on top of aging infrastructure, there's a shift in lifestyle of Canadians. Right, so more people are living in condos, where new condos have appliances such as washing machines now being built within the units. Years ago, washing machines are built in the basements, so when it leaks from the machines, the damage is limited to that area. Whereas now, every other week we hear, or I've personally heard, washing machines leaking or toilets overflooding. So new condos with washing machines and things like that built in are contributing to an increase in water damage claims. There's also some comments that say, compared to years ago, the quality of the construction may be questionable. So that could be contributing to some increases in water damage within the condos. Moving from condos to homes, right, there's an increasing number of finished basements. Right, so there are often tens of thousands of dollars of worth of property within basements. So people have stereo systems and home theater systems in the basement now, whereas in the past, if there were floods or water backup within basements, the damage is very limited. So the increase in that trend is increasing water damage risks. We also found that people are spending more time away from their home and paying less attention to their dwelling. And there's a changing attitude towards the prevention of water damage. Right? Some people are more often more worried about unstable internet connections within their home than a leaky faucet. And so that's what we heard with some of the research that we conducted. And anecdotally, we do see that people are, if the internet's down for half an hour, they go berserk and try to
There's a great quote that, someone would pay a lot more attention to get the internet connection repaired than things that would result in water damage repaired. So.
And then related to lifestyle change, it's a change in human behavior. As urban sprawl and the pace of construction might be affecting the quality of construction in and around the home. And a lot of people are just caring less, it seems, about the maintenance of their home. And this might be due to procrastination and just underestimation of the risk of water damage. So why is this crucial? Why is everything that was stated crucial for water? Well, so from our research, it's clear that both frequency and severity are increasing. And when both frequency and severity are increasing, this could lead to questionable rate adequacy. And if rates are inadequate in the long term, the financial stability of insurers are threatened. So now I'm going to pass it on to Adam.
Why don't you sit here if there's a camera at all? I don't know if that really matters.
All right, Houston, as Houston touched on earlier, we conducted a survey on the Canadian practices. We surveyed actuaries, claim adjusters, underwriters at insurance companies,
Do you want to let Houston do that?
I'm good. Both Canadian owned and part of a global organization. We also surveyed, We also surveyed regulators and catastrophe modelers to get a wider perspective. I wanted to focus today on a lot of our interview questions on just a sample of some of the questions that we ask and their responses to get a feel for some of the themes that came out of the questionnaires, because a lot of the answers were very similar. So in order to uncover the ways in which water damage losses are quantified, we asked actuaries, our first focus was on the actuarial perspective, and we asked them to describe their current processes for quantifying the effects of water damage, their strengths and their weaknesses. And it wasn't very surprising that all insurers either used a traditional rate making or some sort of GLM to quantify the risk. Now, nobody told us they had the golden key, and as Jackie mentioned earlier, we didn't get to survey every company, partially to respect their competitive advantages. So the key may still be out there when we just didn't uncover it. And the software that people got back to us saying that they were using are the usual suspects, R, Excel, and SAS. And
now, we say usual, or we're using lingo that's usual in the actuarial world, and I know everyone in the room and on the phone is not actuarial. GLMs refer to generalized linear modeling, or also known as predictive modeling, which are the big things being used both for auto and property pricing. And R is very much used now in the actuarial programs. It's a software available online and free, and actuarial students are doing a lot with it to do advanced programming. So sorry.
Yeah. So for companies using generalized linear models, Emblem was the most popular platform. And companies that use conventional methods to price water damage risk depend on historical data to varying degrees. To augment their data, some companies turn to the Habitational Insurance Tracking System, or HITS. And according to their website, they contain more than 10 years of claims history information and more than 7 million claims, which are added on a regular and ongoing basis, making it the largest database of its kind in Canada. When we asked about the strengths and weaknesses of the model in use, one respondent answered that there's too great a reliance on historical experience, reducing the predictive power of the model. Actuaries believe in general that historical data is an important source for predicting the future, and although the past data is perhaps not perfect, it's reliable enough, as recent experience would be given a little more weight. One message that was made clear was the lack of industry data for benchmarking and modeling. Actuaries would, of course, be more comfortable if other relevant information was available to supplement their historical data. They want information on how to adjust historical claims for these effects that we've already touched on about aging and inadequate infrastructure, about lifestyle changes, and even weather changes. The AMF paper that Houston was talking about asked insurers to discuss the risk that severe weather and climate change pose to their companies. One particular response that I found interesting actually said, and I'll quote this one, "Its pricing and underwriting are structured for fire and theft-related claims and not for major weather events or water damage. It acknowledged that current pricing is not necessarily well-suited to this new reality. However, if the changes are gradual and observable, then rates could also be adjusted gradually. With the recent extreme events that we've all seen in the last half year, not just in Canada, I'm not so sure if we can rest on those laurels of gradual and predictable changes anymore." Another question we felt that would be important for our researchers, or for our research, was to ask if actuaries actually have the requisite skill set to be able to address water damage risk. Respondents obviously expressed the opinion that the development does lag behind auto insurance, as we have seen auto insurance demand substantial resources due to the regulatory changes and the need to frequently monitor results and report for data industry aggregation, something that property is not subject to.
I'm going to jump in here. I mean, as the actuarial body that commissioned this study, it was very important to the CIA, are we testing and educating our actuaries such that they have the quantitative skills to if they get the right data, to do something with it and price the product appropriately. I think the feeling was that, yes, we have all the statistical tools, we have the statistical softwares. What we're missing is data. When I look around at companies and I see how they're trying to hire, those actuaries with anywhere 5 to 10 years experience with the predictive modeling experience, I'm not so sure that there's a wealth of people out there with that. with that experience. And as an industry, we're going to have to address that.
Right. So all of this adds up to, go ahead, Paul.
Just probe, when you use terms like on the slide right now, it says better data. The term better data can mean a number of different things. I just wondered how far in the report you're going to describe what you might mean by better data. And if I could be slightly suggestive, in the commission of what you're asked to look into, in part this was traditional water damage, like the toilets leaking, or the sewers are backing up because it was intense rainstorm. Those are very different kinds of concerns to anticipate, and the information, I'm not so clear that it's in the current databases that the companies are differentiating between what kind of water damage actually occurred.
Right. I mean, that's one of the recommendations of the good practices I'll talk about, is that coding of what, right now in an auto environment, you've got your BI separated from your PD and your AB and all your 5 different types of accident benefits. But in the property data, are you appropriately recognizing the different types of events that could lead to the water damage, so that you can really get an effect of what is the condo kind of thing, or what is out there more in the sprawl outside city center and sewer backup versus other, an actuary to, and I know we have one in the room, to best price any kind of product. You want your losses matched with your exposure. And there's a big absence of the kind of exposure detail, the pipes that feed into the homes, how old they are, when they were last updated, what material are they, all those kind of things. So there's a lot of data that's missing in the property realm. Sorry.
That's the point of this is a discussion.
Yeah, it should be a discussion. Jump in.
Simply because the resources haven't been directed to property insurance doesn't mean that actuaries are any less capable of pricing it, was the conclusion that we found. In fact, respondents believe that we have the skills, but are, as we just talked about, lacking the credible data necessary to conduct such analysis. Topographic maps, municipal infrastructure the lack of that leads, as one respondent put it, archaic IT systems and unrefined pricing models. Coordination is required with experts such as engineers and weather modelers, geographers, and even various levels of government to gather the data that can be used to derive these new approaches. It's not an easy task, and it's probably not something that's going to be happening in any time soon. But obviously, if we push the issue, and if the more we talk about it, the more other people start hearing about it, then the more movement it will gradually accumulate. So one actuary did decide to go against the "it's not so bad" sentiment and believes that there are no good tools to quantify water damage risk. This actuary believes that a sophisticated model similar to something like earthquake would be required to evaluate the cause of loss inside a house and be able to pinpoint the source of water damage. Sounds difficult, and I'm sure it is, but actuaries have already, partially gone that way, and we believe that we have a good handle on sewer backup. It just needs some attention and some little bit better data, and which is the issue that most people are facing.
The opinions expressed by one actuary.
Shifting now from an actuarial to a regulatory perspective, the regulators we surveyed didn't convey the need for as many improvements. When we asked about the potential effect of water damage and the financial health of P&C companies, one regulator acknowledged it is a concern, but not as much as hail or windstorm. If financial health is defined from a minimum capital test perspective, then water damage is not a solvency issue. However, when looking at it from a profitability standpoint, water damage could have an impact on the financial health. The regulator that we were talking to in this situation said that the magnitude of a water damage claim that would trigger a solvency issue would be that of a very, very large earthquake in downtown Montreal or Toronto or Vancouver, and even then the reinsurance would cover a good part of the losses. Insurance would regain profitability by increasing premiums and limiting coverage. And the regulator also believes that insurers are being vigilant in managing their water damage exposure, mostly through underwriting rules, better mapping of water-prone areas, excluding flood, enhanced risk selection, and higher premiums. We also want to know
I want to make a comment there. OSFI did not participate. They declined to. We reached out to Chris Townsend. And I think it's interesting. So obviously, if the federal regulator who didn't respond, but we had regulators by process of elimination. It's provincial regulators who did. And it's interesting to me that they said that it's not a solvency concern, and it was, but the interviews were in the spring before the floods and the ice storm, et cetera. But the provincial regulators don't have primary responsibility for financial health and solvency. That, for the most part, rests with OSFI. So it's kind of interesting. I don't know that would be, the feeling at the federal regulator.
So we also want to know if regulators see water damage risk specifically addressed in companies' risk management procedures. And because we didn't have as many regulators respond as we did insurers, we don't have as much information to share. But one regulator did say that water damage is in its infancy stage of risk management, and that insurers are taking specific actions to mitigate the impact of water damage claims and future water events. Current supervisory framework doesn't address this specific kind of loss, and it's left for insurers to identify, assess, quantify, control, and mitigate and monitor the risk that they face.
In a world of ORSA, which we're all moving into, and that's own risk solvency assessment, I don't see how insurers could not have to have some procedures or thoughts or risk management framework around water, the fires, and all the different kinds of things that could lead to catastrophic events. So, and really fulfill completely an ORSA mandate. Now, ORSA will proceed in baby steps, but I wouldn't see how you could really do one without addressing it.
So our survey found that Canadian actuaries working for companies as part of a global organization don't collaborate in any significant manner with their internal peers, with the possible exception of sharing studies. One reason for the limited sharing of data is the irrelevance of the external data available globally. The coverage for water damage in Canada, obviously, we said excludes flood, but it is covered in the UK. So there's been exchange of coverage information, but no real alignment between the interglobal firm because the market expectations are quite different. Regarding the sharing of actuarial and other resources, the water damage risk is not a topic on global meetings, and no real tools exist within global companies that could actually be shared with Canadians that we found.
If I can just reinforce that part of the message. ICLR's efforts to look around the world and try to what hazards are being managed by the industry and how they're approaching it. They approached earthquake in Canada, they approached earthquake in the United States and whatever. Earthquake's an earthquake, and we have a role to play, and we have to figure it out. Similarly, wind and wildfire and whatever, I think there's more commonality. What's going on in Canada with water is really pretty different. And in part, a lot of Americans don't have basements, and for a whole bunch of reasons, the global companies don't say, I'm getting direction and here's how we're handling it somewhere else. We're really on the front lines, not entirely, but certainly in terms of the magnitude of what this is. And when most people come to us and say, what's unique about Canada, they think about us being cold or something. But it's really this issue. It's quite an interesting one. So we're doing a lot of pioneering work on this, trying to figure it out.
So going to a claims and underwriting perspective, they obviously provide valuable input for quantifying and influencing water damage risk, as they are the front lines of managing it, whether it be writing business, adjusting claims, or helping prevent or mitigate claims. We wanted to know what current prevention efforts are in place. These activities are directed at the behavior of insureds, at the definition of insurability, and in the insurance product itself. Our research found that insurers may require the installation of backwater valves, an in-home examination, or an acceptable range of things like roofs or water heaters before providing coverage. The insurer obviously may exclude coverage, require increased deductibles or lower limits, offer discounts for applying adaptation practices, such as including the use of superior building products or the use of better than building code construction. One problem with all these wonderful ideas is the difficulty of changing insured behavior towards prevention. One respondent did say that awareness can be a helpful tool to get insureds to change, but a passive approach. The most effective methods for changing behavior of policyholders are mandatory requirements or premium discounts. Municipalities should encourage insurance companies to charge more for non-compliance of proven prevention efforts, and insureds should require the homeowner to oblige. We did find much discussion about the lack of significant efforts directed at prevention and human behavior, partly because weather events are considered to be rare and unpredictable occurrences, and those who have been affected in the past often consider themselves unlikely to be affected again in the future. I remember reading up on the Calgary flood recovery efforts in the aftermath and how there were very few families who were accepting the flood zone relocation grant. I'm sure there's many factors that went into the decision to stay for those particular families, and I'm sure one of them would be the chances of another flood occurring in Calgary in those areas. On top of the rarity of being affected multiple times, it's extremely easy to just point the finger at the problems outside the home, shrug your shoulders, and say, I can't control anything out there. My awareness level personally has changed only because I've been immersed in this for 6 months of research and learning how real this problem is. It even made me get on my parents' case because their downspout doesn't have the extension going away from their home. And I asked them why they don't, and they just shrugged their shoulders and be like, who cares? And so I put one on, and I'm sure I'm not going to get thanked for it. But when their foundation's not crumbling, then
You'll feel good.
I'll feel good.
That's a rare skill for us.
And the only reason I did it is, again, because I was doing this for 6 months. And when you just read these news articles, on once a day, and you say, oh, flood, you're like, oh, okay, there's flood, and you kind of shrug it off. But until you just start seeing every day about all the little things that can go wrong, then you start changing your behavior, but it's a very slow process. So the role governments play in addressing the factors that give rise to increasing water damage is important to understand, as regulatory action could become a reality if costs escalate to the point where availability becomes an issue and the homeowners remain passive in their mitigation efforts. Respondents didn't believe that governments would get involved at this point, but there was the sentiment that regulatory action would increase the overall costs. After seeing the 3 major water-related events since these discussions, it would be interesting to see if these responses actually change. Companies do want to see governments address these factors. They want higher building standards. As one respondent said, there's nothing guaranteeing the work is done properly, and changes to the building code for new construction requiring mandatory installation of loss prevention devices. The problem exists in the National Building Code itself, and I know that Paul and ICLR have continually been talking and writing papers and reporting on how the National Building Code does need some work, and Dan too, I see him in the back of the room. But it has very vague wording on the protection of homes for sewer backup. So and again in this question, we found respondents pointed to the aging infrastructure and data sharing as factors that need attention. It was nice to hear the federal throne speech in October last year talking about how they're going to allocate resources to building community resiliency. Hopefully it follows through. So we'll shift focus now to from surveying companies to finding out.
Before you do that, I just want to say there are about 25 pages in our research paper that just summarize the response to all these questions about the current Canadian practices. What the underwriter said, what the claims people said, that I think are of real value. There's like bullet point list after bullet point list as we summarized everyone's feedback. To me, once this is public and actuaries download it and can share it with everybody, or ask your actuary if you're not an actuary for a copy of this, I think that's a lot of value to the paper as well.
So we'll shift focus from the surveying that we did of the companies to finding the global resources that were available to help insurers now. So we'll thank Google for finding this. And so as you can see on the slide, we didn't find a vast amount of literature on this topic, but we found some. There's definitely not enough time in this day or energy levels to go through and explain the details of all of these papers. But one paper that was quite interesting was the paper Climate Change and Its Impact on Building Water Damage, which was probably one of the best reads of the ones that we found. The paper summarizes a study establishing claims models that quantify the link between external water damage to houses and other variables using GLMs. What I think is important to get out of this paper is the data used in the study. It takes population and frequency claim data from losses caused by precipitation and snow, block pipes, and links it with the daily values of precipitation, temperature, water runoff, and snow water.
It's from Norway.
Yes.
Just to set the stage.
The weather variables include both observed and climate model data to help alleviate the notion that the past is no longer predictive of the future. The modeling process does described in the paper, might require its own seminar, but I will mention that the study separately modeled the number of claims and the severity to derive their projections. The results of the study, to no surprise, probably will be increasing of future losses, but it does caution that there may be substantial prediction uncertainty. Regardless, there's a starting point for modeling water damage risk and suggests that there may be benefits to insurers who focus on climate change adaptation. When we gave this presentation at the University of Western Ontario seminar 6 weeks ago, as Jack has mentioned, one of the other presenters was a professor of engineering. His name was Dr. Simonovich, and he wasn't too fond of the idea that actuaries are still using GLMs, generalized linear models, to price water damage, or even modeling with GLMs in general, because he believed it was antiquated. And he was pretty taken back by this. He was just said basically, well, we don't use those anymore. So part of the discussion that came out of the Western seminar was that there's tremendous possibilities for advances in actuarial modeling if we can find the synergies with engineers and with people who also have, who have a vested interest in being able to model systems that are, community systems that we have. So now that's the end of my portion. I'll turn over to Jackie to discuss good practice for Canadian P&C actuaries.
And before I do that, in the chapter called Global Alternatives, we highlight not only one of y'all do that for me, it distracts me. Not only the paper from Norway, but there's a paper from the University of Stockholm, and there's a paper from California. And part of the value to the CIA and to actuaries and insurers of this paper is that we spent 6 months digging through thousands of internet and Google hits to hopefully consolidate in 100-page document where others can then go and find out more information. And then hopefully some of these models or these papers that we found will spark ideas or contacts and relationships and be for companies to build more productive and effective property pricing tools. So it's my job to kind of bring it all together in terms of what are good practices. The CIA asked us to report on existing practices, what the problems were in using historical to predict the future, and to recommend, actually what they wanted us to do is recommend existing best practices. And 2 points. We didn't find any existing. So what we could do is recommend a future state that we would work together. And I don't like the term best practices. And over the last 5 or 6 years, I've written a lot of papers on a lot of different topics, and including the catastrophe modeling one, and it's all best practices. But as I've done my global research, particularly out of Europe, I find the term good practice being used because it's kind of naive to think we're ever going to get to that best practice state. Everything's always emerging, new information and technology is being developed. So if we could get to a good practice state, that would be terrific. So that's the wording we use. I've already talked about the fact that not all insurers participated. So good practice number 1 of 6 is the identification of and access to the data that's required for pricing, be that by an actuary or an underwriter or other quantitatively, skilled people at an insurer. We suggest that a first good, and now here we are really in KPMG, recommendations and thoughts. We suggest that a first good practice for property pricing for water damage would be the clear articulation by actuaries of what they need. So such a list could be prioritized according to what we must have and what would be nice to have categories. We suggest that insurers could work with existing industry organizations, be it IBC, the ICLR, to identify the types of data that may be best achieved by industry-wide initiatives and the types of data that need to be considered more company-specific due to confidentiality and proprietary purposes. And to price the specific risk of water damage, actuaries require claim data aggregated by causal loss, and we mentioned that before. And such data may not be readily available right now if the claims people, when the claims have come in, have not historically recorded that in the detail necessary. So we need to identify it as soon as possible, so 2 or 3 years from now we have the data that we need. To price properly, actuaries and others need the ability to link the claim data with the detailed exposure data. The exposure data would reflect characteristics of the insured property, as well as risk characteristics in the local environment that are related to that risk of water damage. Slide 24 summarizes the types of data specific to an insured's property that are valuable for pricing. And this focus was personal price, obvious, personal property. It wasn't commercial or study. For example, what's the age and type of roof? What's the condition of the foundation? What's the slope on the driveway? What's the landscaping around the home? In 2011, the ICLR published a handbook. It's a little handbook titled Protect Your Home from Basement Flooding. And we actually used this. I think you must have received it on your interview. And at the end, a survey to measure the risk of a basement flooding. And we copied this list of questions in our paper. And depending on the responses to 14 questions, there's points assigned and an overall risk score is developed. Some of these questions are seen on this slide 24. We believe that the answers to some of these ICLR questions actually may provide a starting point for the identification of property-specific exposure data types. We suggest that a good practice would be the consistent use of a questionnaire that is modified to best reflect the specific cause of loss leading to water damage if that data was collected through underwriting and then tied by claims for actuarial or other pricing analyses. So it's got to be a multiple effort across an insurer. No one piece of the insurer can do this in isolation. The actuaries have to work with the underwriters, have to work with the claims to make sure everything is collected and the right type of information is collected. And you need to get your IT people involved too, because it's got to be recorded and accessible. Data about the local environment. To price property insurance products for the risk of water damage, one must have information about the local environment. This includes data about infrastructure supporting the insured property, such as the age, diameter, and construction material of pipes that lead to a property. Oops, I don't think we're there yet. Collaboration of the P&C industry with government could help facilitate this collection of external data and thus be a very important initiative to enhance the good practice related to data. And I know some of you are taking notes. This is all in the paper, and actually we'll call the CIA when we get back to the office and get an update on how soon it's going to be released, and then we can get back to Paul. He can share that. So this is the good practice that we envision getting to, where you've got the right kind of detail about the property, you've got the right kind of detail about the local environment. What is the current state? To date, most P&C insurers have not captured all of this data, either the property or the local environment that's required for the detailed pricing analysis. To move to a good practice state, as I said, is really going to require the coordination of everyone, the multiple disciplines within the insurers. Even if all of the property-specific characteristics were identified and collected, there are questions as to the availability of that local environment data. And that leads to our second best practice, which is the IBC Municipal Risk Assessment Tool, the MRAT. So I'm going to really read now exactly from our words, which are from our report. Given the proprietary nature of MRAT, IBC reviewed and actually edited our report. The opinions expressed are of those of IBC and not KPMG or the CIA. And I said this at the presentation to Western Ontario when IBC was in the room, actually. I speak very carefully using the words that they've given us permission to use. Not speaking on their behalf, but reporting what they've shared with us. I mean, it's very much a work in progress. IBC is gathering information related to the infrastructure of cities for this tool. It uses municipal data to, I quote, quantify the risk being underwritten with respect to sanitary sewer backup caused water damage. It's a web-based tool that will allow municipalities and potentially insurers, that hasn't been decided yet, to assess the impact of severe weather on urban drainage systems by displaying risk zones to indicate the relative degree of risk. The program MRAT incorporates data related to the current state of infrastructure, claims history and climate change, as well as future projections to, and I quote again, predict and display with a high degree of accuracy the probability that infrastructure failure will occur within a quarter of a city block. MRAT combines data on the current condition of infrastructure and how it might be affected by future climatic events to produce risk maps that identify where potential municipal infrastructure vulnerabilities exist. And an example of one of their maps is on the slide and is in our report. It's currently in a pilot phase and undergoing technical reviews with pilot cities across the country. It's expected that municipalities will use MRAT to understand how future extreme weather events may affect their infrastructure. It is particularly valuable as municipalities currently have few, if any, tools available to quantify the susceptibility of their infrastructure to severe weather events. The IBC believes that the widespread use of MRAT could potentially lead to the ability of insurers to identify relevant variables for decision-making in both pricing and underwriting. Insurers' claims data could be matched with municipal infrastructure data in a sophisticated regression-based pricing model. Now I'll go off script. If you think of earthquake, basically you're taking your whole insurance company exposure profile with all the details about it and putting it over the detail about what happens under the ground. That's what the CAT modeling firms do. What ideally would be able to do with the property is do the same thing. These are my homes. These are the details of those homes. Let me see what the potential for infrastructure failure is underneath it. So this is, segregating the flood in the condo because the dishwasher overflowed and leaked through. From that, that's really the sewer backup in that kind of situation. Back on script. An improved availability of insurance coverage for sanitary sewer backups is one of the goals that IBC believes MRAT could lead to. If a municipality was able to prioritize its infrastructure improvements for vulnerable areas with high risk, then insurers would be able to better understand the risk, setting appropriate premiums for these homes. MRAT is believed by IBC to be a mutually beneficial partnership opportunity between municipalities and the insurance industry. It's a step towards tackling climate change through adaptation because of MRAT's ability to evaluate the sewer backup risk. Furthermore, the insurance industry and municipalities through MRAT stand to be able to provide better service to the community that they both share, to the consumer they both share. Good practice number 3 is related to the coding of claims data. And it's tied to the first one, the availability data. Good practice for property pricing requires that actuaries have that ability, I keep coming back to this again and again, to link the claims data with the exposure data. Thus, actuaries require the accurate cause of loss coding for all property claims. It's particularly important following the occurrence of the major events in Alberta and Toronto. Many of the losses that arose from the Alberta flood in particular were covered by insurers as a goodwill measure, not necessarily covered by their reinsurers. And this goodwill was to enhance the long-term relationship with the customers and not because the peril of water damage was actually covered in those insurance companies' policies. For actuarial pricing purposes, it's very important that such goodwill measures or extension of coverage are distinctly coded so that analyses can be made of valid claims as defined by the specific insurance policy at any particular point in time. That's very important. We need to say what the policy wording is as actuaries. We need to know what that is. We need to know our exposure data. We need to know what our claims are related to that.
Does that lead itself to a clear interpretation when there's a claim? Aren't you asking?
Well, I think what my understanding is that some clients, some insureds, had the endorsement for the sewer backup. And, at address 75 they may have, and at address 77 they may not have. But certain companies gave coverage everywhere. So if there was some identifier in the claims record, a little check, yes or not, they had yes, it was paid, it was a backup, but, did we take premium for that?
Well, the definitions were not the same across the industry. Some were ambiguous, and, there's all these issues. So the coding cannot be better than the reality, So.
Right. I mean, again, there's no one area of an insurer that is going to be able to tackle this on their own. It's not a switch of an IT field. So, but it all needs to be looked at and evaluated.
Plus, insurance companies are going to try to get trigger the treaties.
Absolutely.
So they're not going to code something as goodwill.
But there were deliberate actions this summer that actually happened, and there's a lot of data that came out of Alberta to not be able to use in some way would be a waste of a lot of data.
Like in that case too, of those insurers, there was news reporting on that being a goodwill. So I mean, I guess depending on the severity of some event, the company could essentially maybe to exercise their treaties, like you're saying, eventually get in there. But if there was a lot of news reporting on certain companies, that you can bet the reinsurers would probably be asking.
Well, the strategic management. I mean, when those decisions were made at the highest level, knowing what the implications.
Remember, Dan, we're asking people to code when they're under extreme pressure to handle volume and so.
And it's not, in some cases, they've contracted out. They don't even have the staff for themselves. So they've brought in people from the U.S. They set up temporary shelters. So it is extreme circumstances and difficult situations. The fourth good practice we set out was the prioritization of property pricing by P&C insurers. Historically, Canadian P&C insurers have directed significant resources to the pricing and reserving of Canadian automobile insurance, especially Ontario Auto. And this attention is understandable. Like my Thompson News was full of, an NDP saying Liberals not moving fast enough this morning. And I know a lot of insurers who are feeling weighted down by the fiscal rate changes that are being imposed on them, so they think they're moving fast enough. The attention on auto insurance is understandable given the volume of that portfolio that's written in Canada, all the different reforms that have been implemented across the country in the past 15 years. That's where our connection first is on auto reforms, and the financial significance of auto insurance to so many Canadian insurers. Furthermore, the active rate regulation that exists in so many Canadian provinces for auto insurance necessitates a greater degree of actuarial involvement to simply comply with the rate filings and the justification for rate changes, and none of that exists in the property world. Each year, there are numerous P&C insurance industry conferences sponsored by organizations like the CIA or the Ontario Conference of Casualty Actuaries, IBC, MSA Research, and all the major accounting firms. And you can almost always count on a session about auto. What's the latest, the auto update? It's the exception, not the rule, to find a session on property insurance. Now, given what's happened in the last 6 months, that may change. But if you look at the last decade and you look at all the programs, you're not going to find a lot on property insurance. As a result of all this emphasis on auto insurance, the extent of actuarial resources that are dedicated to property pricing in Canada is far less than that of auto. And the implications of fewer resources include less visible demand for the required data. So no one's out there yelling at IT or claims we need this data. There's limited development and testing of models because inevitably an actuary needs to be borrowed from one department to help support some crisis related to auto. And just in general, less expertise overall, throughout the whole Canadian market of actuaries. The limited actuarial resources that are allocated to property pricing restrict the ability of insurers and the industry at large to gain that sophistication in property pricing that is necessary given the increasing claims that are seen from this peril. New and innovative techniques to price the risk of water damage are not going to occur unless insurers are willing to dedicate the resources. And that's going to involve human resources and IT resources, which means money. It's going to take time and it's going to take dollars. Given the increases in property losses in recent years, particularly the water damage, it's important for insurers to commit these resources, we believe, and for actuaries to demonstrate their value in pricing this risk. Good practice number 5 is collective efforts by the P&C insurance industry at large. During the interview process, there was discussion with some participants about the need for developing an industry standard for data collection, both about the local environment as well as the risk characteristics of insured properties. Some actuaries talked about bringing back the Brown Book. IBC produced information on auto, on Ontario GL, and I guess back in the day before everything was electronically transmitted, they would be received with a harder colored copy. There was a green, a red, a blue, a brown book, and the brown book was the property. It was discontinued a number of years ago. I question whether different insurers' practices are so different. Their wording is so different. How they code things is so different. Whether there'd be real value in bringing that all together, but it was, suggested by some actuaries we met with. There are two significant challenges in moving forward with any type of industry-based initiative related to the property pricing of water damage. First, there are a couple of large Canadian P&C insurers who have already dedicated significant resources to this and view their data, their information, and models as proprietary. The second significant challenge is actually related to political consequences, actually about MRAT. And if the P&C industry were to collectively work with government, particularly municipalities, to collect the data required about the local environment, a long-term plan is likely needed to address any issues that could arise because of availability or future affordability. And this is Jackie Friedland speaking, not KPMG, not the CIA. I've spent almost my entire career working as an actuary in risk management for self-insured public entities. So I consult to the province of Alberta and the Durham Municipal Insurance Pool and the Waterloo, Ontario Municipal Pool. I did it in the States, and I've done it here for the last 15 years. And when I read about MRAT and thought about it, I thought, what if the city, Ajax, Whitby, decides to partner? And I don't know if they are or not. What if they partner and they give all this wonderful data about their infrastructure, and then they asked all the insurers who provide coverage and in those postal codes to provide their claims on top. And then all of a sudden they find out all these vulnerabilities, and no one in that town can get coverage, or the prices skyrocket. Well, everybody who was on city council that chose to participate, they find themselves out of their city council position. So they're just, and I'm just throwing out, again, no one from the press, quote me, please, just throwing out issues that will need to be thought about as we bring that data together to ensure we don't end up with any kind of availability or affordability crisis for the citizens across this country. So, recognizing that there are challenges, that there are insurers who feel their information is proprietary, that there are political considerations, we still believe that a state of good practice would have the industry working together to enhance all aspects of actuarial property pricing, not simply the data collection. The final good practice is on emerging models. With the state of rapidly evolving technology and global communications, there continue to be advances in modeling, and particularly models that are widely available and shared via the internet. In our paper for the CIA, we described 3 models that we discovered during our research process. We expect that there are other models that we're not aware of, and that additional models may have emerged since we produced this report this summer. We present these simply as examples of models that may prove valuable in the future for quantifying the risk of water damage. Currently, none of these 3 precisely match the need of Canadian actuaries for pricing property, but it's reasonable to expect that these or others could be modified to provide very useful tools. One is called the OASIS Loss Modeling Framework, and these are easy to Google, and I think in our paper we provide web links. The OASIS LMF, I'll call it, is a tool that's currently used for catastrophe modeling. It has an open architecture loss modeling framework that's available to the global community. The OASIS LMF has four primary objectives. One is to encourage transparency in the development, use, and validation of models, to build a community that will increase the supply of CAT models and information, to stimulate innovation and design and hardware efficiency, and to create a viable environment allowing the commercialization of tools, models, and consultancy. We spoke via email with the project director, and he explained, I'll quote, how he thinks the potential for the software is used for water damage. We at OASIS provide a simulation kernel that's very fast and secure and a financial module. The software that's being tested is what's known as plug and play. It means if you have a hydrologist that knows about sewer backup potential or other non-flood related water damage, they could build a module using this framework that could be used on their platform and would include the impact of insurance conditions on an insurance portfolio. So it's not currently structured to work, but it's got the potential for. We also identified a company called Computational Hydraulics International, It develops and supports software for stormwater, sanitary sewer, and watershed modeling. Currently, this model is used almost exclusively by engineering firms and municipalities. It's based on very, very detailed infrastructure data, including pipe diameter, pipe elevation, manhole locations, connector pipes, and it uses all this to calibrate, validate, simulate, and analyze the impact of water-related events in very specific localized areas. So, I mean, it's really taking things to the next level. It would require an insurer to partner with engineers, and this professor at University of Western Ontario, who we spoke with 6 weeks ago, he was actually very interested after our presentation in, how can they use their expertise and their modeling capabilities from an engineering perspective and team up, partner with the insurance companies to actually be able to build the models that would appropriately price the risk. When we spoke to the people at Computational Hydraulics, they said it would be challenging for insurers to use this software right now because there are very copious and detailed data requirements and inputs, and you would need that engineering partnership. The last model we identify in the report is called Ambiential. It's from the United Kingdom, and it's a flood risk assessment firm that provides detailed flood risk information at the zip and postal code level or at the individual building level for all sources of flood risk. Now, it's a different definition in the UK from here. It was founded, the organization, in 1997 as a partnership with researchers at Cambridge University. And it's, again, another one of these global partnerships forming with industry and researchers. According to its website, it assists insurers by providing urban flood risk mapping and modeling for river, tidal, and surface water, exposure mapping using geographical information systems, catastrophe modeling, building vulnerability assessment, and loss estimation via a linkage between hazard maps, financial models, and exposure information.
I'm sorry, I believe you have a typo. It's Ambiential.
AL, not IAL? Okay, thank you. Okay. Note that so we can fix it before the CIA paper goes out. Thank you. So those are the end of our 6 good practices recommendations. Again, I said to the CIA Research Committee, I said at the University of Western Ontario, I'm saying here and wherever else we speak, we'll be presenting at the Casualty Actuarial Society Rate-Making Seminar in DC in 2 months. This is a first step. We're not going to solve this right away, and it's going to be efforts that require real partnerships, pricing with GLMs and classification and territory rate making, the actuaries can maybe do on their own, with the, systems of great big data warehouses and tools that exist and are all, can be bought off the shelf. But this is a problem. We don't have the data. We don't yet have all the tools built. It's really in its infancy. But it's nothing that we don't have the skill set to handle if we get all the pieces of the underlying puzzle that we need to then build it.
Can I ask 2 interrelated questions? One is that it's been out for a little while within the actuarial community for comment. Any significant comments that have come in?
No, it actually hasn't been out yet. The CIA hasn't released it at all. It was just, we submitted a draft in the early summer. We went back and forth with this committee of 6 till we got to a final state in September. And now it's just through the processing of the CIA, which takes longer than we would like it to.
And CIA initially were looking for a different kind of study, and then it evolved into this. Is there discussion that you can share with us within CIA about something that might follow this?
I haven't heard any yet. The press release that we just saw this week that will accompany it does refer to this as a first step, and they'll seek input from the actuarial community as to what would serve them best next. But it's more than just the actuarial community. It's what do the insurers want and need.
Trying to phrase my question to seem overly simplistic. I had understood that catastrophes and floods actually came into the actuarial model twice. The first part is with the actual claim data, you look at the past behavior, put it in the actual losses that you've seen before, And then again, it came in during the cat loads. So at the end, when you have to put in something bad could have really happened. All of your 6 best practices dealt with the claim behavior. Was there any questions or thought about the cat load part of the pricing model? Do you have any?
I think they're first of all, cats aren't included precisely because this isn't including flood. Now, to the extent that a cat results in sewer water backup, then it is included. So, and when you talk, there are 2 different exercises actuaries do. They do reserving and they do pricing. And both of those exercises start with an estimate of ultimate claims. You know, you look at your past, you project your ultimate claims. Hopefully you have exposure data that link it to any of the actuaries in the room. Correct me if you think I'm misstating anything. Okay. When you look at historical claims to project that ultimate, which can be used for reserving or pricing, typically you would exclude your unusual large events. That may be a GL settlement for multi-million, or it may be a catastrophe property event. That's unusual. You take it out of your triangle, you take it out of your data, you project everything else, then you've got to add it back in. And there's different ways of adding it back in. So you wouldn't be doing it twice. That wouldn't be appropriate. That would be double counting.
Back to a question though, is if you take out the large events from the main part, the claims number, are you understating the impact of climate change? And
no, what you have to do when you take it out is you have to have a process for adding it back in. So historically, that adding it back in has been very simplistic. 20 years of here are my reported losses excluding it. Here are 20 years of my large losses. They may appear in 2 or 3 years. What's my total average, my ratio? Let me add that in. The point is you can't really do that anymore because things are shifting. So that's what the CIA was asking us to do. You know, why can't you do that anymore? What are the reasons why so we can understand? And that was what Houston spoke about. And then they asked us to say, what are the existing best practices that our companies are using to modify that? You know, this traditional ratio of a cat loading. No one that reported to us had any answer as to how they've really modified that. So then we've got to say, okay, so that needs to, we know models need to be built in the future to address that, but to build those models, we need data. You know, data is going to be built on partnerships, data is going to be based on, you know, with more dedicated resources to the topic. You know, the models may be built using tools that, you know, we're not used to using right now, like those last 3 I talked about. So, but there's no magic bullet, no golden key that exists right now for doing it.
I think one of the shifts is you know, this whole, you know, at least for P&C actuaries, so we're seeing triangles all the time. You know, we're moving. It seems like we're moving away from triangles, and you know, we're already seeing that with GLMs, which you know, obviously don't, you know, not a traditional development method, but you know, when you're talking about the catastrophe and removing that, or taking into account this in the catastrophic setting, it's just, you know, maybe we just rethink the whole issue of what's a catastrophe, what isn't, and just model the system. You know, I don't know.
The 2 things that confuse me, and it's Grant from PASIC, if you look at New Brunswick and Alberta, for 5 years, the loss ratio, the 5-year average loss ratio is over 90%. So I know it's not driven by actuaries, but at some point, that's crazy. And there's an adjustment. And when you talk to regulators, they say, it's not a problem. Of course it's not a problem because you haven't passed those on yet. But the reason it's not getting passed on is that it's 5-year average. At some point, the actuary is taking 3-year average, and oh yeah, well that one's a mistake, so we'll pull that one out. That's not really it. Well, it's been 5 years. There's a new normal going on here, and I get the models and the linear part of how actuaries set prices. But I don't get the pulling out the cat losses to adjust and then adding it back in. I just, as a non-actuary, that's always confused me.
Go ahead, then I'll have a comment.
Well, that's an excellent point. I wonder if a competitive market really allows for pricing catastrophe risk, because, you know, human nature being what it is, so we shouldn't necessarily blame the actuaries for taking out the losses. I think the losses may be in the models, but when we had good results, or when the catastrophes have happened, so bad nationally. There's, you know, just.
But you go into, you know, I get my quote from my auto insurance. They have to charge what the actuary filed as the rates. Okay, that underwriter does not have to charge what the actuary has recommended for the property price. So I don't, and some companies don't even have an actuary that is involved in pricing property. They're so busy doing the auto and the reserving and helping comply with all the OSFI requirements now that they're involved in, that they're not even doing that.
For years, we haven't charged for the earthquake risk, not to the extent that they should have.
You know, so it's not historically been. I don't want to, you know, there's lots I'll take responsibility for as actuary, but I want to take full responsibility for the 90% loss ratios in property.
For 5 years.
And for 5 years.
1 year, everybody can do, but after 5 years, that's when passive has to take notice, right?
Okay, 2 questions.
More a comment. I'm just trying to reconcile this in my own mind, but I'm not even sure what I want to say. But the one actuary in your question there answered something to the fact that we should look at a CAT model approach like we do for earthquake. The problem with that, earthquake models, hurricane models, etc., those are for low probability, high consequence events, right? That's what CAT models are for. Basement flooding, urban flooding is not a low probability event, especially these days.
Right.
It's common as dirt. So you have the actuarial approach, where you take tons of data, as much data as you can, and do your thing. Then you got the CAT model approach, where it's little data. There's very little data. You're looking more at, you know, we got to find probably the middle ground between those two things. And what that middle ground is, I don't know. But I think one or the other is not going to work.
Well, one of the 3 models that we suggested, CHI, Computational Hydraulics International, their model is very, I would say exposure driven, right? So they take the diameter of the pipes, take the location of the pipes, take everything like that, and they have once the model is calibrated, they have a pretty good idea of, you know, when certain rainfall happens, which area, back up, right? Which source will back up. So if something like that is used and insurance information is overlaid on that, then you have a good idea of how to price that. So I think that might be that's one of the areas you can go into, where it's kind of not CAT modeling and taking some of the insurance information and overlaying on a model that would help that. But even that model is very data intensive, right? You have to input a lot of.
Even if you started from that ICLR questionnaire with the 14 and you picked 4 of them, you know, the slope of the driveway or the downspout, you know, some of those things, and the actuaries had that for a couple of years and could try to correlate some of those factors with what contributes to, you know, water damage. And we just don't have any of that historically, you know. Or some companies don't have that. They're the ones that we spoke with. I'm sorry.
In one of your first slides where you said that the past is not predictive of the future, and there's a number of reasons, and you said climate change, yes, a little bit, but not significantly. Aging infrastructure, probably a little bit more. A few other reasons, and then you said human behavior, and that intrigued me, and that means a lot more to me now after the ice storm. And how do you even begin to account for that? Because, you know, in the ice storm, I mean, I'm a little bit old school, right? I have my names on my accident and all that stuff, and I stayed in my house, and I think I protected it to a large degree. A lot of my neighbors left, and they came back to frozen pipes and water damage. Right? So, people, you know, and I'm thinking between me and my kids. So, I mean, they sat on the couch and said, my cell phone doesn't have reception. I can't do anything. And I said, you're a health. You know, they can't clean ice off the driveway because there's no app on the iPhone to do that.
There's a market there.
And I think these are classic, extreme examples, maybe, of what you meant by human behavior.
Yeah, you know, we weren't going to include that. That wasn't in our first draft. You know, this was a very interesting research project because we won it in the fall. You know, we thought we had identified all the material by, you know, the mid-spring. And then every day I get to the work, I open up my thing, and there's another article with another link to another study. So, I mean, we were still putting in studies in July between drafts. And we ended up in the summer adding human behavior. There's a couple of pages on it and referencing to studies at Wharton, the University of Pennsylvania, and Columbia Business School, and study, the 2013 RBC Canadian Water Attitude Study, and an MIT study. Like it really talks about.
Yeah,
but what do you do with that? I mean,
I think back like to my childhood in rural Manitoba, like this. Within hours of the storm, every able-bodied person would have been out cleaning up the trees.
Right.
And here in Toronto, we all sat.
I had still have trees in the annex.
Back on for somebody to send to someone to cut their tree down, right? So a totally different response, and we were paralyzed because of that to a large degree. And so I find it really intriguing that you recognize that factor, but I'm
not sure what you do with it.
Okay.
Again, it was part of, as actuaries, mathematicians, we can say, okay, this trend is happening, okay, let's just do the math behind it. But the CIA said, okay, well, before we just do the math behind it and going forward, let's try to understand it and see if that understanding helps us alter our math and models. But I'm not sure that the human behavior.
So some of the sentiments I at least personally got from the interviews that we were conducting was that, like, the whole thing, you're exactly right. We do, everybody's waiting for somebody else to fix the problem, and even from the people that we were talking to, that's what it sounds like with the mandatory of doing things. Like, we don't want governments involved to tell us how to do things, but we want them to do something else. We want them to put in some pumps, and there's obviously very good reasons for there's proof to do that kind of stuff. But even the insurers are basically saying, hey, I don't even know how to handle human behavior in our insurers. Yeah, we send them flyers on prevention tips. Who even looks at the mail anymore, where they're going flipping through and doing something else. But it's just from that personal thing of, like, if you're just looking at it every day and you're actually paying attention to it every day, that's the only real way I see that you can change a human behavior. And it's putting yourself in that situation, and who knows. And from an insurance perspective, I don't like the one respondent said it's a passive approach. Sure, it's a passive approach, but how many times before you get bombarded with something that you either get pissed off or you start actually looking at it and say, maybe I should take a look at this.
Yeah, so my question wasn't so much how do you change human behavior, but how do you quantify your predictive models?
Why don't we just assume that these events are going to occur, and they're going to, and we assume that as a company or as an industry. I'm not an actuary. I'm more of an operations person, but just listening to this and reading about the events that have occurred in the last couple of years, and actually lived through very many in the insurance business and from a claims perspective. They happened. They happened in 2005. 2005 was almost identical to what happened in 2013. In the identical spots in Toronto, by the way, just about. And it's going to happen again, because we are going to have another huge storm, and regardless of whether the infrastructure is fixed down at Yonge and St. Clair, and it's not fixed up over in Etobicoke somewhere, it's going to happen. So I like the idea we're talking about the CAT modeling and the gentleman in the corner understanding that it is happening, and we keep taking them out and putting them in. And some of the suggestions we're talking about today still sound to me as if we're basing it on historical data and predictive modeling. Just by gathering all that information, we just had 6 points of gathering historical data so we can run it through new models. But I don't know enough about buying cat bonds and what they prevent, and certainly what they may do in the U.S. Insurance industry. But if we accept as an industry it's going to happen, it's going to probably happen every 5 or 6 years. In fact, I remember 1999. It happened in Toronto again, only because I was on CAT teams running out to people's homes. So I know it occurs. So if we buy it as an industry, as a CAT bond, either between insurance companies or insurance companies take it upon themselves, perhaps as a competitive edge, whatever they decide to do, that it's always going to be there. There's always a pool of money. It's almost a bit like the wind pools down in the U.S. But I think we have to look at it.
That may be one thing, but to still not price your property product correctly, I think is, so I'm not saying necessarily historical, because I don't think you can go back and get all the historical. So now when we underwrite things, can we collect the information that matches all these exposure characteristics with the losses that are going to come in? So 2 or 3 years from now, I mean, one good thing about property, unlike GL and AL, auto liability, I'm going to know my losses right away at the end of the year. I don't have a lot of loss development on it, And so I don't have to look at 5 or 7 years and worry about the trend and the tort reform impacts and all those other adjustment factors. Get be 2 or 3 years where I can match exposures and whatever, where I've got more of my same weather patterns happening, you know, that's a first step. But yes, the industry may look at cat bonds or other things to help the industry at large, but we can't keep pricing a product wrong.
Yeah, and I
Jackie Friedland's opinion, not.
we have to absolutely price exposures, and we can do that with the information and some of the information we get, because that's just going to, in terms of competitive advantage amongst all the carriers in the room or actuaries, that will always happen because that's how you do business. But I just think as an industry, it's something that it's going to happen.
But it's not happening now if it ends up at a 90% loss ratio for 5 years straight.
It's only because of the way we rate or code or reserve or how we look.
Because the price it's because losses are taking too much of the premium dollars and the premiums aren't sufficient to cover them.
A common question. In my head, when I looked at your slide, most of them were rating, because that's what I started in. That's what I envisioned the role of the actuary is to set the price.
And that's the study was about property pricing.
But all the detail that you have in there about risk and this house is bigger than that house, that's underwriting or picking which risk to choose to insure. Is the role of the actuary as envisioned in the paper rating, which is setting the overall number, or using those tools to help companies underwrite, which is picking the better risks in them? Is that?
I mean, to me, pricing is a combination of both, because actuaries develop not an overall rate. It's not one rate, this is it. It's all the factors associated with it. For these endorsements, it would be this kind of load. For this territory or this, this area. So there's a whole bunch of factors assigned to a rate. So it's both. Is Betty Jo still here? I mean, the whole pricing is broadly defined. I would take it broadly defined. It's an overall rate level indication that I'm going to file with Fisco, I need a +5. It's more than that.
Okay, can I follow up with one other question? The other thing that I didn't see, which I think is important when you set the rate, is territories. And some of the MRAT stuff is, I know which pipes and which cities take care of things, so as an insurer, I don't want to go to wherever. I don't want to pick on Hamilton all the time. So there as opposed to there. And for the actuarial purpose, at what point does the buckets or making the buckets really fine or detailed help, as opposed to having broader territorial buckets make your life easier?
But, I mean, that question...
We're at 11:30, so I just want to collect who else has a question coming. I don't want to cut things off, but we're getting later here. Okay, so if we're moving toward the last question, if we can respond to Grant's question, and then any general comments you want to share.
And that question for property is no different than auto classification rate making. There's a paper we all had to study as actuaries, a longly cooked paper on credibility. If you cut the cake into too many slices, it all crumbles and you don't have anything, you don't taste anything meaningful. So it's no different. You need enough information so that whatever's coming out of your model or your analysis of claims and exposures has meaning and reliability. And that will differ from insurer to insurer and province to province and city to city and, peril to peril in terms of how you get your data. It'll be a decision that actuaries and others pricing the risk will have to decide when they look upon the data that they've got. That's a good question.
Okay, any last question? Jackie, any last thoughts?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think this is the last time in this capacity. So, it was a pleasure to work on this paper, and it's been a pleasure to talk about it.
If anybody would like a copy of the paper, let us know, and we'll sort out with Jackie and the CIA the right way to approach it.
Right. It'll be on their website for downloading as soon as it gets that final approval.
So if I can remind everybody, our next get-together for Friday Forum is February 21. We're going to talk about earthquakes in Ottawa with Darish Manazundian of Carleton. He's done some really interesting detailed work on the risk in Eastern Canada. And our program is set for the first part of the year. So please keep in mind that we do this roughly once a month, covering a number of different topics. And please look forward to programs ahead. But today, thank you to Jackie and Houston and Adam for sharing your research and the current emerging work on understanding how to price the risk of water damage. So thank you, Jacqueline.
Pleasure.